The Mandalorian Season 3 concluded recently, and me being the nerd that I am, decided that I had to crank out some sort of a breakdown, analysis, perspective on the whole situation and on what unfolded, both in terms of story and in terms of general cinematic movie business, Star Wars industry developments, I suppose, considering all the drama, nonsense, chaos, and just the general kerfuffle that the Star Wars universe and franchise has been ever since the purchase and transfer from Lucas in the hands of Disney. And we've all seen that, and we all know what went down and what has been going down ever since. We all know the massive disappointments of the trilogy, the new trilogy. We all know the ups and the downs and the crazy shit and the boring shit and, most of the more disappointing, underwhelming, and also sort of frustrating developments. The crazy, chaotic nonsense that the movie side of the franchise became. A movie franchise that really became for nobody. Like, I don't understand, and I don't know who the target audience for those movies is supposed to be, because it's not old fans, it's not new fans, not fans of the prequels, I mean, and not fans of the originals, not fans of everything that came after, like in the extended universe. Me, myself, being a fan, starting with the video games and some of the more extended universe stuff, certainly cannot fathom and cannot understand who exactly this is supposed to be for. And it's not for kids as well, because you can't argue that you made a franchise for new fans, for young children nowadays, considering that you're just basically rehashing everything that happened in the previous iterations of the story and adding nothing. I mean, that's going to wear a thing very, very, very fast. I don't imagine a ripoff having the staying power that the Star Wars franchise in general has had and has been proven to have in the hearts and minds of the kids that grew up watching it, whether you're Generation 1 and came up with the prequels, or you're with the originals, I mean, and then you're Generation 2 and you came up with the prequels. On top of all of that whole mess, something came along that none of us expected. Something which was surprisingly and shockingly able to galvanize and unite fans, which had grown bitter and had turned their back on the franchise in sort of a surprising twist of events. Nobody saw this coming. Nobody had massive expectations for the Mandalorian shows or any of these Star Wars shows at all, really, when they started coming out, considering the failure of the new trilogy. Turns out Star Wars still had a little bit of life to it, and the Mandalorian came out. We were all shocked and we were all stunned to discover that actually something of quality, intrigue, something interesting in terms of story and in terms of direction could come out. Something that was original in its take, but added to the universe, but also was respectful and drew upon the existing legacy. Something which was both respectful of what came before, but also was paving the way for something new. And ever since then, the fan base has been, in my opinion, quite evidently united behind the Mandalorian and the wider Star Wars TV show universe. There have been some ups and downs, there have been some controversial moments, like with Boba Fett, and, people's expectations meet somebody's creative vision and somebody's execution and somebody's interpretation read on a character, and they end up being disappointed and shocked at the end result. So maybe if you expected and you had this picture and this vision of Boba Fett as this just like ultimate badass that you sort of, as a child, when you first saw him on screen, you filled in the blanks yourself and you created a vision of this character which is very personal and very strictly your own, and now you can't accept or for by any means just be at peace with sort of the goofiness the way he was portrayed in his own show, like a panther. But you have to at least acknowledge, whether you're a hater or whether you're a lover of this new TV show Star Wars Renaissance, that whether it's good or whether bad, whether you like it or whether you don't, it's leaps and bounds, head and shoulders above the movies, the recent three movies, or not just even the recent three movies, stuff like Solo and all that, because it actually has an identity and it has a creative vision of a creator and of a man who's like, has the ability to think in terms of wider storytelling, narrative, world building, because Favreau and Filoni have showed that they really are capable of thinking deeply, and they have like a very intuitive emotional sense and like instinct in terms of how to structure the universe and how to really progress the story forward. And like genuine creative vision is something that is always much, much more valuable than some corporate mess, basically. And like inevitably, if you have a vision, you're gonna end up falling on your face. Like some people are not liking it, and some people are gonna end up loving it. And sometimes a creative vision can be so unique that it ends up off-putting a lot of people. Like we can argue some cases of extreme horror movies, for example, like they do that. But a vision is still a vision, and it's much more valuable than a lack thereof, regardless. So, if you have genuine storytelling at play, you're going to have some controversy, and you're going to have some people who are not happy. It was the same with the prequels, really. Like, say what you want about those movies and say what you want about Lucas himself. He had a fucking vision, didn't he? And he fucking really went out of his way to put that vision on screen, and you got to respect that, man. You got to respect that, because that's a creator, that's a creatively minded person at the end of the day. Compared to who exactly? JJ and what's his face? Ryan or Brian or whatever the fuck his name was. All that fucking shit that they put on screen. Kudos to George for being the crazy motherfucker that he really is, And kudos to Dave and to John Favreau for, putting in the care that they put in to realize whatever visions they have of what this franchise needs to be, can be, and should be. And if there's any hope for Star Wars, it's in their hands. Now, I touched upon a little bit about some of the controversy surrounding the shows themselves in this long-winded introduction. And Mandalorian Season 3 has not been immune to attacks, it seems. I didn't really get into watching the show as it was coming out because, like, as happens with these types of shows when they take hiatuses and they disappear, well, life goes on. You have your things to do. You have your job to go to and whatever, responsibilities to handle. And you sort of, if it sort of falls off the radar for you, you don't really remember or think a lot about The Mandalorian in your everyday life. Maybe like when I was a kid, these types of universes and, fantastical stories used to occupy my daily life a lot more, which is absolutely normal, of course. And maybe for kids nowadays, that's probably the case. Not maybe, but probably that's the case as well. Most likely, for 100%. But, you're an adult. And you have other things that occupy your mind. And all of a sudden, this show that you did enjoy when it was around comes back around out of nowhere after 2 or 3 or however many years it's been away, and you haven't really paid much attention. It rolls its way back into the sort of pop culture eye, and like your reaction is like, oh, look at that, The Mandalorian is back, I guess, There wasn't really that hype that, I guess, if you have a show that consistently comes out every year, you would have, because, like, before, favorite shows of mine, and I think this is most likely generally true, when you have like a schedule and you know that something is coming out at a certain time, you sort of lock in and you expect it in sort of a logical way. That's really gone out the window, I think, in recent years because of streaming and because of COVID and all that, But regardless, The Mandalorian and the Star Wars shows particularly have a very, very peculiar way of structuring whatever the hell it is they do and the way that the show comes out. Like, there's no consistency that I can put my finger on as somebody who doesn't really pay that much attention to the developments day to day, but really just sits back and waits for the show itself to come out. You know, it used to come out in winter, now it's coming out spring, I guess. Like, I remember watching Luke Skywalker with the green lightsaber in November, and now I'm watching the season finale around Easter. Strange, for sure, you know. And however, like, I know Obi-Wan came out last year. I didn't really pay that much attention to that. And before that, Boba Fett was around, and I did watch that. And it's like, it's just too much and too sporadic, you know. So when The Mandalorian itself came out this season, I was like, okay, pretty cool. I guess I'll watch it eventually. Wasn't really in a hurry because of that lack of hype to sit down and watch it. I wasn't sitting there with bated breath waiting for every episode to come out, you know. And I started noticing, interestingly enough, disdain. Some disgruntled voices were popping out here and there from left or right, criticizing the show all of a sudden. Stark contrast to the reaction of the internet for season 1, for season 2, and this was being heralded as the franchise that will save Star Wars, and even very, very critical like voices on the web, like the guys at Red Letter Media were like giving the show the rub. They were surprised, you know. So like, how do you go from fan favorite and something which was adored and heralded as refreshing, wonderful, and, you know, how do you go from this hope-filled praise to all of a sudden lumping the show in with all the rest of the nonsense that generally does tend to come out, passed off as entertainment nowadays? You know, there is this trend on YouTube, after all, of people that criticize and are very, very critical, or predominantly critical voices of modern day entertainment, Hollywood, TV, and whatever. And there's reason for that. There's plenty of reason for that, of course. But, you know, it's a very, very quick and interesting turn of events to have this show, which was like the savior, suddenly fall from grace in its third season, not after its fifth or sixth or seventh or eighth like GOT did, but like in its third season, and be lumped in by the more critical voices on YouTube in this sort of bin with all the rest of the schlock that comes out. So I didn't know what to think, and I didn't know, you know, like, it didn't really give me a lot of hope. My lack of excitement was further compounded. I didn't really feel like this necessary urgency to check out the show. Some pictures started coming out with Megan Thee Stallion and Jack Black in some ridiculously campy environments. People were memeing on those. I'm like, what the hell is happening for real? Has this gone to shit for real? But then a meme came out. Another meme came out. I mean, like, I came across it on Facebook or whatever, of a very, very important scene, a very, very key to the identity of this season scene, I think. The scene on the barge, that small little exchange with Bo-Katan and Din, and that sort of pledge that he makes. And it wasn't the whole scene, like, but it was just one key phrase from it and the reaction of the character. And that, like, compared to all of the skepticism that I saw being thrown and thrust the show's way, all of a sudden my interest was piqued, because it really doesn't take much. All of a sudden, an intriguing plot point, an intriguing moment between these two characters, which I had no idea what the context for it was, sparked my interest and really whet my appetite. You know, you start thinking to yourself, okay, interesting. Is this a new relationship that is happening? This is I mean, it's a ship that you certainly have a very easy time supporting, considering these two characters and who they are. And is this an indication of what the plot of the actual season is to be? Retaking Mandalore? That sounds exciting. It certainly does. I like the idea of Bo-Katan's character developing in that direction, and I like the idea of a potential romance between these two. You know, interesting. So let's check it out. And that's what I did. So, I don't know why I felt the need to go down this very, very long-winded intro. I suppose that's just my style, but at the end of the day, the takeaway watching the show that I can present, I mean, it's in the title. I think all of the cynicism and all of the skepticism, though I sort of understand where it's coming from, is misplaced when you direct it at this show particularly. I think that, you know, I get it. It is a bit goofy at times. It's certainly kiddie and childish, maybe even at times. But overall, it delivers enough creative integrity. It delivers enough quality in terms of storytelling and, you know, overall entertainment. And it's still a breath of fresh air, in my view at least, compared to all the visual noise that passes as film and TV, and really all the cynicism that modern day TV specifically is drenched in, you know. I guess it's worthwhile to give sort of an overview and sort of a like overarching analysis on, you know, the story and the season itself. Give sort of a story breakdown, which, you know, the channel is called Narrative Analytics, which is a sort of ambitious name, I guess. Instead of just giving context and, you know, waxing poetic, it is worthwhile to get to the point and actually give some breakdowns, and, you know, sort of defend my overall point and my overall takeaway. Now, it's not going to be an organized breakdown really necessarily, but it is going to be roughly following the structure of the season. And really, I think I have more of an eye for themes and ideas than I do for details and like specific hooks, let's say, in terms of story structure. You can definitely see some issues there with the season, but that's I guess I'll give a little bit more details as to why I don't really consider that to be that significant of a criticism, all things considered, going forward. But it's like overall, like it was a very confusing starting point for sure, because the season finale of season 2, where Grogu is handed off to Luke Skywalker, was such a great culmination to that storyline and to the whole plot point with Din trying to give Grogu back to the Jedi. And Luke's cameo was amazing and astonishing, and the entire world was rocking because of it, you know, really. It was lovely to see. It was Star Wars nostalgia done right, you know, compared to all the empty plastic corporate nonsense of the new trilogy. The creative integrity that underpins Filoni and Favreau's approach to these shows, I mean, made it so that nostalgic moment, that callback, did not ring hollow. In fact, it was exactly the opposite, because you have this foundation of these new characters who you're invested in this sort of independent storyline, which is enriching the world, the wider Star Wars universe as it's developing and as it's progressing. And in that setting of like stakes and emotion and, you know, something that's new but draws upon the past, bringing back a character like Luke in that key moment, like it was not cheap, it wasn't hollow, it wasn't empty, you know, it was significant in a sense, because it added to the stakes of the moment, you know, and it added to those emotional that emotional moment at the end, that emotional goodbye at the end, that's really the foundation. And you need the foundation of character and novelty in story in order for you to be able to pull off nostalgia properly, because nostalgia without direction of, novelty and storytelling is really just, like, it's empty, it's nonsense. So after that, some confusing stuff happens left and right. Grogu is there, but then he's not there, but then he wants to stay, but then he wants to leave, and then he leaves, and then they get reunited, and now they're back together. And like, okay, so what was the point of us following them along for 2 seasons with the idea that he was going to be given back to the Jedi then? So immediately I feel a little bit frustrated watching the show. I'm like, I feel like you've led me along a little bit here, show. Like you promised me something and then you baited me. And are you doing this just to keep milking the cow because you need the Baby Yoda dolls, and without Baby Yoda and Din Djarin, that's not... The Mandalorian is not the Mandalorian anymore, and you can't sell the toys, and you can't really push this to your audience. Is this a money-based decision, or is this a story-based decision, or is it both? Who the fuck knows, at the end of the day. But it was frustrating. And the whole plot line, which is the genesis of season 3, with Din reclaiming his honor, is based on this. And it feels like going backwards, like, wasn't the whole point of you and the kid, you growing out of this role of the Mandalorian, of this cold-hearted killer, of this, man who lives in the distance, who keeps his distance from everybody, like the Coven stipulates, so to speak, like they do, like they're very isolated, and you were, but all of a sudden you come out of your shell and you warm up to this character and you develop these friendships, and you're no longer this lone gunslinger, but you're this guy who is led by heart and care and affection for others. Doesn't it defeat the purpose for you to now be going back, apparently? And for what reason, really? You walked your path with the kid. You brought the kid back to, like, his family or his home or whatever. What are we doing here? There was a lack of investment, and there was already a little bit of frustration and skepticism on my side when we really get into this. But you very quickly realize that there is a plan, and there is a necessity, and there is an idea behind that drives and really guides this development, that pushes the story forward in a way that's logical, both in terms of plot and in terms of character. And in fact, it's a very lovely development. It's lovely because it's lovely to see the growth on an emotional level for a lot of these characters. And you understand very quickly going down and through the season that it wasn't nonsense. The show didn't waste your time, by supposedly going back in storylines and going back in storytelling. But in fact, the going back was the setup for the future. And I think that's maybe a bit of a theme for this season. Going back to your roots to recover something in order to find the way forward. That's very Jordan Peterson-y, especially when he talks about Pinocchio and the belly of the whale and all that, metaphorical stuff. But it makes sense that this is a sort of a theme that's common in storytelling across history, because it's true to life. It draws inspiration from the genuine experiences, maybe sometimes, that people have. Sometimes when you feel lost, going back is actually going forward. I suppose now is the time to mention the character who is a very, very key, very important, seminal to this season character who undergoes this type of a journey really herself, and that's Bo-Katan. People's problems with her really range around the fact, I gather, that the general audience dislike for her comes from the fact that, she, in earlier seasons, and I guess in the Clone Wars before that, she comes across as very entitled, arrogant, stuck up. She's very smug. She has this pride in this way she carries herself that's sort of It's not very endearing. And then she is confronted by the unyielding desire of Din to redeem himself at all costs, almost, and the dedication that he displays in her moment of greatest and utmost devastation, because really, in the beginning of the season, you find her depressed, defeated, surrendered. All of her dreams seem to have crumbled away. All of her desires seem to have, been taken away from her. And she feels like this absolute failure, And this is where you start to put things together. This is where you start to understand that the going back that the season supposedly, steps on initially is actually, it's not a going back, it's a going forward. Things from earlier seasons start to connect and they start to make sense, And really the setup for the future starts to unravel. As a result, you begin to understand, and as the season progresses, you start to put it together more and more, that the Grogu's path and Grogu's journey, like, he had to go back. He could not have stayed. You thought his journey was one way, but it turns out it was another path, and you understand that really they should have stayed together to begin with. It wasn't really the idea there was not for them to be separated and for them to something else to happen. That's really a bait and switch. Almost in a sense. Turns out that things are developing exactly the way that they should be, and by the end of it, it all makes sense. And here, really, in this moment, it's key. It all starts to fit when the Darksaber is brought up and is mentioned, because the saber itself, the Din now wields, that he got off Moff Gideon, is the impetus for Bo-Katan's failure. The arrogance and really her independent ways, her plans, her schemes, what she had really been trying to do and what she had been trying to implement for decades almost in trying to recapture Mandalore, really came to a collapse with the Darksaber itself slipping through her grasp. And the Bo-Katan that you see in earlier seasons, who's very driven, and this is something that's not really explicitly laid out because she was sort of a secondary character in that, but the significance of her journey, trying to retake Mandalore and gather the forces, falling to pieces off screen while Din was doing whatever the fuck he was doing, it hits you when you see her, in this in this light. And there's almost a bitterness, a disdain there, all of that ego and all that pride and all of that entitlement that she used to display is really bitter in her mouth. Like she's choking back all of that pride, and she's like almost resentful and disdainful towards Din when he shows up. And he himself walks up on her, pure-hearted, just like a picture of dedication, because he's lost as well, like he doesn't know what the hell is going on and how he's supposed to make sense of everything. And, he had a little bit of a crisis of identity before that when Grogu left, and considering what he did and how he, turned his back on the Creed, and, like the commitment to reclaiming his identity and figuring things out and putting things together, and the fact that, he accepted that Grogu needed to be with him, and now he's finding a way for that, but he also is not turning his back because he simply can't, considering where he comes from and his background and what the Coven did for him and how they gave him purpose, and him reclaiming his identity as a Mandalorian in his past, and just this honest, earnest dedication that he has to these principles, the pure of heart energy that he brings, confronts the bitterness of this collapse of ego that, she sits there on her throne. It's sort of a mockery of a throne because, like, she's alone. There's nobody there. There's just one robot, and she sits on a throne presiding over a kingdom that doesn't exist in a castle that's empty. It's all a fucking mockery and a sham, complete, parody of her ambitions, really. And that's a very good way. That's a very, key word there, ambitions, because retaking Mandalore for her was an ambition. It was a flex of ego. I am the queen. It is my right, and I shall be queen one day again. You know, that was the driving force behind her decisions. And we're going to quickly see down the road that ambition turns into a cause, a real just cause, a grounded just cause as things progress and as things develop. So, you know, we do this whole dance where Din goes back to Mandalore and he kills the monsters and he goes down. And this is where you see a lot of the sort of the criticism and a lot of the, I guess, understandable dislike that some people have towards the season maybe shine through because it is a little bit goofy. I mean, it's these troll-looking monsters with 4 eyes and goofy clubs, and it looks like something out of Dark Crystal or like whatever the hell that David Bowie movie was. And it's like, whatever, man, you know, like I can't say I was that invested. And then he goes down into the depths and he meets this weird spider looking fella. And that's like something very prequel-y. And he's got the eye and he's sort of creepy, but also he looks like something out of fucking Wall-E or, you know, some other Pixar movie. And, you know, this is where I guess you got to make a choice. Like, are you going to really hold this show up to some sort of an expectation like it's a serious, legit show like Game of Thrones was in the beginning of its run? Or is it a show which isn't set in the Star Wars universe? It's sort of for kids. And it has its goofiness and its clumsiness display themselves occasionally. And I think if you accept it as it is and you don't let it bother you, you're in for a cool ride. And if you really like are hell-bent on holding sort of the goofiness of the show against it and really focusing on that, I understand why it's off-putting, but at the same time, I think you're sort of robbing yourself of a lot of quality entertainment that is to come. So we basically skip over all of that. We skip over the monsters and the goofiness and the fighting and all that. And the seminal moment, you know, we're really looking at character development and main plot progression here, you know, and the character development here is what spurs the story along, and it's really what's exciting and what really grounds the season and makes it good, like legitimately good in terms of narrative, objectively. You know, Grogu goes back to get Bo-Katan for her to help, and I guess Din banks her and her, like, lifting her ass to help him because he naively, and the guy is a little bit naive, he's an idealist, is amazed at the fact that he discovers that Mandalore's atmosphere is not poisoned, which is very convenient of a discovery in this particular moment. This revelation to him is something sure to revitalize Bo-Katan's interest in the quest sort of to retake the planet, because he thinks that, you know, what he knows of her, it's her love for her home world that drives her. So he expects almost this revelation to be for her like this, like, oh my God, really? I guess I gotta go back. Almost exhilarating experience, or maybe something along those lines. We, of course, as an audience, can see that that's maybe not quite the case. And when she sees his fighter descend, what does she say to her droid? She says, let's get rid of him once and for all. What does that mean? Was she gearing up to fucking put a blaster bolt in his skull? What the hell was that? You know? But it's really the peak of bitterness and disdain of her. And of course, she's confronted by young Grogu, and the goodness in her prevails. You know, he is a kid, he is a baby. She can't really say no to her. Maybe some of the motherly instincts common to women in general awaken in her, and she can't really say no. And some of that bile sort of melts away. And I guess she makes the decision, okay, fuck it, you know, I'm going to go and help this guy. I can't really say no to this kid. The goodness in her prevails, essentially. So she goes off. She finds him. And this is where really the intrigue of the season and these conversations out down there in the sewer really takes off. The subtlety within the communication and the exchanges that these two characters have, and how that serves to later on build the plot in the season, it's really fascinating to behold. You see some of that skepticism and some of that cynicism roll off her, but you see also the spark of hope and love and loyalty that exists in her towards her homeland and towards her past. She speaks about her father, and at times she's a bit cynical as well. And, before her, she sees the unyielding loyalty and pure of heart that Din displays. Because to her, sort of the story of her father's sacrifice and his death is almost comical. This is what we always do. We Mandalorians, we fight. They come for us. They fight us. We die. All of us die all the time. We're just dying. We're just failing. That's our honorable, I guess, life. And she almost wants to believe, the cynical, nihilistic take on history, on sort of the meaninglessness of their way, of their creed, of their people, of their life, of their culture in that moment. And he just responds with his, given response. This is the way. This is the way. This is how it's supposed to be. Loyalty and honor above everything else. And you see in that moment, that little bit of pushback that he gives, it's something that she needs to hear in that moment. It's something that connects her back to her past, to her dad, and to her upbringing, and that makes sense from a character development perspective, like your younger years and your relationships to your parents are what define you and what build you as a human being. And it makes sense that in this moment where she's fallen almost, that little push to connect her back to her past, to her origins, to her upbringing, and to her father, and who, really taught her and everything that she believes to be sacred and important, it almost brings her a little bit of relief in that moment. And that's where slowly the bitterness peels away and peels away and peels away. And she recovers a little bit of that faith and a little bit of the value that she really sees her people and her culture with. And later down the line, progressing through the story, going down into the depths, he takes the shower. She goes down to save him. She sees the omen. She goes back, and they fly back after the Imperials destroy her home, this sham of a castle, of a kingdom. A very symbolic, by the way, moment, because it's like you've sulked in this empty castle enough. It's almost the destruction of the home. You have no way back. You can only push forward. It's the same from a sort of Joseph Campbellian hero's journey perspective. It's the same that happens to Luke when they burn his home and, his aunt and his uncle. It's like, it's almost as if fate, destiny, God is telling you, you need to step forward. Your journey continues now. There's no going back to your little corner, your little depressing sort of empty house for you to sulk on your throne with only a robot to keep you company. Enough of that. It's time you reclaim your birthright. And maybe I'm reading a little bit too much into it, but I think it's a little bit of nice symbolism that you can put into it. Anyway, her path and her presence and her time with the Coven is very, very interesting as well. I mean, it's wrapped up in the general sort of kookiness and goofiness that has been a part of this show since season 1, which is why I don't understand why people were really so much critical of the season itself, considering that even back in season 1, we had a giant rhinoceros try to eat Din, and Grogu saved him from the giant fucking rhino and whatever. And that was, come on. You can't really take a show seriously or expect it not to bring in the giant monster pterodactyl chickens, considering that, they've been doing that with, there's a giant monster every season that they go after. So the goofiness is really a part of the trend. It's a part of the show's identity almost. So that's why when they're going after the giant chicken and, then they bring the chicks back and Grogu's being Grogu and he's being all cutesy looking about, that doesn't bother me because this is like what we signed up for from day one. But really what's interesting here And all of the characters have a very important presence. The Forge Master has an important presence. Vizsla, he has a very important presence. You know, he goes on his little fucking journey as well through this. And they very, like, they endear themselves to you in these sort of moments, because you see a little bit before there were sort of these cold forces that were presences within Din's life. But now you see a little, they're a bit humanized almost with their presence in this season. Not overtly through dialogue necessarily, but just their general, the roles they occupy, companion, guide, you know, not just for Din, but also the warm acceptance for Bo as well. Like, that humanizes those characters, and you know, a little bit of that mystique is peeled off in a good way, I think. But really, what we have to focus on is Bo-Katan's reaction to the whole situation. She comes into it very apprehensive, but she knows she has no choice. She's developed this bond with Din. He's displayed this loyalty and this commitment and this honor and this value, you know, and really the heart that he has, the love that he has, and the dedication, even though he's not a Mandalorian by blood, to the way, really like impresses her in this moment of bitterness. And considering her reaction to the fact that he was a child of the Watch, and really the children of the Watch in general, and the reaction displayed by her people and her former companions and comrades to them later on, like, they almost look down upon these primitives, as they call them, these zealots, as they call them. The entitlement that she really displayed before, that people found sort of to be off-putting, that's gone. And the slow little changes, subtle changes within her behavior, are monumentally indicative of what she is going through, of the journey she goes through. All of a sudden, she enters this coven with a bowed head, humbling herself before the very primitives and the very savages that she would once, in her kingly pride, look down upon. And, you know, like connecting the dots from her being this entitled, chosen one, self-proclaimed chosen one, to losing her destiny, to falling short of capturing the saber and uniting the armies, her plans, her fleet, everything falling apart, being lord over the empty sham of a kingdom, discovering this guy who really pisses you off with his intrusive, almost pure of heart nature, and then going down the path of changing your perspective on him personally, to then end up being and living with these so-called zealots and these so-called primitives, but not looking down upon them, but, you know, bowing your head before them, is masterful character development, I would argue, you know, even though none of this is necessarily signposted, which makes it good. This is something that you pick up on as you watch, you know. But the satisfaction comes from really witnessing the transformation of this character, and witnessing these characters come together, and witnessing at the end when the Forge Master asks her to take off her helmet, the almost hesitation and like fear, almost childish fear that she displays. Not like she doesn't want to do it, because all of a sudden, from being somebody who scoffs at these primitive ways to somebody who values and respects and is humble before the tradition and really the spirit of honoring the past that these people display, is, you know, speaks volumes to the progression that this character has been on, this journey that this character has been on, and the growth there. And that's when Bo-Katan takes a turn from being off-putting and arrogant to being somebody who you genuinely root for, and it makes all the sense in the world what happens afterwards. It makes all the sense in the world why she would fail previously, but, you know, potentially succeed now, because where she was coming from and how she was approaching the goal before was different from what it is now. Now she had to go back down into the very grime. She had to go back down and really reconcile with, this rabble of primitives. She had to really go back down into the roots of the most fundamental identity of her people, really, that the children of the Watch in their extreme laws preserved. And it makes sense that if a civilization falls, those who dedicate themselves to the preservation of the purity of that culture would turn, considering their small number, to these rigid ways of life. And, her aristocratic disdain towards these people gives way towards her realizing like how much they actually give a damn and how much they care about her people and her culture, and that really turns her around on them. She reconnects with the spirit of her ancestors through these people, and all of a sudden, humbling herself in her previous arrogance, she attains this sense of respect and appreciation and like really awe for these people and what they managed to achieve and how they managed to protect and preserve Mandalore and the spirit of Mandalore. And what happens later on, her bringing the armies together, her going back to the actual planet, along with everybody, uniting her people for the first time, truly, and at the end, retaking the planet and claiming her rightful place. The continuity of that and the way that it makes sense afterwards, when you look upon the whole story and how it progressed, really puts into perspective like how valuable and how genuine the creative vision and like the heart that Filoni and Favreau put into these shows, which is, going back to the earlier interlude, the reason why we fell in love with The Mandalorian and these Star Wars shows to begin with: integrity and heart and genuine vision for storytelling. And that's still there. It's right there, because the journey that Bo-Katan goes on, for her to be able to complete her quest, no longer driven by arrogance and ambition, but going back down to humble herself into the very origins of her people, to then rise back and understand through humility that compromise needs to be made. And all of a sudden, her quest is no longer that of entitlement, but is a quest of... It's a cause, it's a genuine desire, it's a genuine concern for her people and for a desire to have them be united and safe, overcoming all previous hang-ups and all previous like pride and ego and dismissing some for the sake of others. She failed when she fought, driven by that, and then she succeeds fighting from this grounded care and the fact that she becomes this vulnerable person who questions herself throughout this process, and for Din to then be there to reassure her again with his pure of heart sort of presence, his almost naive dedication to these principles of honor and respect. It's masterful character development. It's a great journey to go on, and it's very, very cleverly done in terms of plot. It makes sense why things would fall into place the way that they do, considering the progression of the characters and the story itself. It all fits, And of course, Bo-Katan ends up being this likable character, whilst before the wider fandom, some were fans of her and some saw her sort of, didn't care for her much, let's say, and she becomes a very, very strong fan favorite, at least in my eyes, in this season, because she goes down this path. And this is the heart of the season, and this is the heart of the show. The heart of the show is heart. That's really the one thing that you can say about Din as a character, is his heart. That's what makes him endearing. That's what makes you root for him, love him. And that's what really is the impetus and the spark that he uses to influence others around him for them to progress and for them to grow, and then you see that and they become endearing to you, and then the plot ends and things come together and the people are united and the planet is retaken. All of that based on, underpinned by these emotional shifts in character, these endearing changes that happen in these people. It all comes from the heart first and foremost, which is why the scene of the season, that very touching scene, which really sparked my interest and whet my appetite to go back and watch the show again. It is a clear demonstration. It is the epitome of the heart, at the heart of the show. That vulnerability from Bo and that reassurance that comes from Din. It's such an intimate, nice moment, man. And they seem to be teasing a relationship between the two afterwards. They're in the culmination when they fight together, and really they sort of at the end huddle together with Grogu and protecting each other, and he's protecting them. And she even had sort of a motherly moment with the kid, reassuring him like a mom would, trying to like smooth things with the dad, and the dad, unknowingly is being sort of maybe too firm with the kid, but like she says, it's because he believes in him, and like it's a very, very lovely, almost pristine picture. And I'm all for it, and I think generally the fans seem to be all for it as well. It's such a well done scene because of that. And, that wider context contributes, but just the scene itself, the purity and the vulnerability on display, and the purity and the vulnerability, but also sort of like this dedication, this sort of firm, reassuring presence that Din provides for her in that moment. It's very lovely. It truly was very lovely to witness. Like a lot is being said in like the wider culture these days about like what women are and what men are, and how men and women should interact with each other, and what is toxic masculinity and what is toxic femininity, and this and that, and what about power dynamics, and should a man have more money, and all this red pill, blue pill, black pill, white pill, whatever. At the end of the day, man, it's like Din in this moment, like, is true, genuine masculinity, Like, he's a man, but he's also not he's not a groveling at her feet, but he's not trying to, like, be overbearing and almost, he's not putting ego into this fucking interaction with her, because he very well could. She is his superior, Maybe a lesser man would allow that to sort of bruise his ego a little bit, for him to not be able to provide such reassurance to somebody precisely because of that messed up power dynamic. And she's a woman in power right there, but she doesn't abuse that as well to put him down as a man, and she shows this feminine vulnerability while being a woman in power, and she shows this masculine reassurance like a knight does to his queen, even though he is technically her inferior. And, considering all the things that are being said and all the emphasis that is being put nowadays in the cultural discussion as to how men and women should interact with each other, and all the noise out there, it's refreshing to see just, a scene like this, which puts all of that to the side and just shows you, if it's genuine and if it comes from the heart, things work. And really, maybe that's all that's necessary at the end of the fucking day. It's a great little scene, and there are layers for you to unpick that I sort of tried to imply without explaining or going too, like, marring myself too deep into. Generally, we can say that this scene, which is symbolic and the epitome of this storyline, of this relationship, of this character journey, which serves for the impetus for the main plot, which ends in a very glorious and, wholesome way. This is the foundation, the spine of the season, and it's more of the same. It's more of the same spirit that Filoni and Favreau put into this show all the way back to season 1. So as far as I'm concerned, the integrity of the show is still there. It's preserved. And it's still a whole lot of fun, and it's still a whole lot of heart, and it's still very valuable and genuine because it's there. The spirit is still there, and that's why it's worthwhile watching it again. And this is why I can't buy into all the criticisms, that the show has fallen from grace. Really, because to me, the reason why we fell in love and were heralding the Mandalorian as the savior of the Star Wars universe, it's still there, man. It's integrity, vision, and creativity, and heart, and soul, and it's still there. And it's in stark contrast to a lot of the entertainment that we get, a lot of the shows and movies that sort of fall on their face because they're too corporate and soulless. This show is still a breath of fresh air compared to all of that. Now, I guess it's worthy to discuss some of the criticisms because, this show, the title of this video really is, so what was it, goofy, childish, but still a whole lot of fun. Going back to the earlier, interlude and discussing sort of the criticisms that were levied at the show and my initial shock at, as it was coming down the pipeline to me, I understand why some people are off-put. I do. I understand, like I said, about Boba Fett. Like, if you grew up and you had this vision of the guy who was just like a badass and just like cold as hell. He was like Lorenzo Lamas from Snake Eater or something. And then you see him and it's Tamara Morrison sort of doing these goofy jokes. I see why you would be disappointed, and I was a bit off-put as well, And The Mandalorian does that too. Some of the more childish and some of the goofier things that are happening in the show. The Jack Black thing and the droids and all of that. Megan Thee Stallion, very interesting, peculiar choice, whatever, I understand why people are off-put by it, but I don't think it's something that necessarily you should allow any of that to spoil your fun or to spoil the heart that really that stands at the center of the show and of the season. Because, there are a couple of things to say for this. First one is expectation, man. If you have these expectations and you have these visions of the show itself that are based on your childhood and your childhood relationship with this franchise or some of the characters in the franchise, be mindful of the fact, I think, that nothing will ever compare to what you had in your heart and in your mind when you were a child, living through experiencing these things and these characters for the first time. And I suffer from this as well sometimes when I have these massive expectations for a certain story or a certain show. I lived through it with GOT a little bit. You spend so much time sometimes thinking about these characters that are like your friends almost. You fall in love with this world and these characters. They almost live in your mind and in you, and that's a very personal experience. If a creator comes along and he puts his spin on something, it's inevitable that there will be dissonance between your personal experience and relationship with the story and the characters and somebody else's creative vision. I think a little bit of disappointment and a little bit of bitterness is normal on that front. It was normal back when the prequels came out. It's normal now, at the end of the day. But try to step away from that and leave expectations to the side and approach these shows with an open heart and an open mind, because I have to remind you once again of the empty, hollow corporate nonsense that was given to us in episode 7, 8, and 9. And ask yourselves, is that what you want? More of that? Or would you rather somebody like John and Dave try to put in a genuine effort and have a genuine vision, or even somebody like Luke to make something, even if it ends up falling flat on its face for some? I think it's better, and I think as long as there are people who have that approach, there's still hope for Star Wars. When people like that disappear, and it's only the Kathleen Kennedys and the J.J. Abramses, that's when we know we need to screw away. Like, we need to bugger off. That's when we all should be leaving. As long as there are people with vision and with heart, even if you don't like the spin or the interpretation, give it a shot and stick around. Now, another further criticism: consider what this show has been since day one. I mean, it's never been gripping drama. It's never been mature entertainment. It's always been sort of hokey. It's always been sort of goofy. It's always been sort of cartoony. I mean, Dave Filoni's experience working on the cartoons, Clone Wars, Rebels especially, like, it comes through in the show. Like, some moments in the show do feel like cartoons. They do feel like something straight out of a damn cartoon, like, for sure. I can't argue the objective reality that is the case, but that's always been the case. Like, if you really liked and loved The Mandalorian in season 1, I mean, it might be too much for you, or it might be the particular thing itself is rubbing you the wrong way. And by particular thing, when I get to the Megan Thee Stallion, you understand what I mean. It might be too much, might be this specific something is a little bit too much for you. And that's understandable. I'm not knocking the legitimacy of having that experience. But once again, I think, for me at least, I was able to set that aside and enjoy the show regardless, because I'm accustomed to the show being like this. I'm accustomed to it being kiddie at times and goofy at times, because it's always been like this, man. It's never been cutting edge entertainment for adults like Game of Thrones was in its original, like, 2 or 3 seasons, And it's a show that's made for kids, for, at the end of the day. Exactly. So you shouldn't be terribly surprised that the show is sort of like that at times. Now, on to Megan Thee Stallion. Sure, not the best actress. Sure. Questionable casting. Why her? Who knows, really? Some producer made that choice. The same producers maybe who ruined 7, 8, and 9. And man, if I get to have the same story and the same heart at the foundation of the season that I did, I will tolerate Megan Thee Stallion for 1 episode, 2, 3 scenes, whatever, man. Goofy, kooky acting, sure. Was it really that bad, though? Did it really have ruin your experience with the show? I mean, it didn't for me. It didn't bother me that much. It didn't stick out too much as a sore thumb. I think it was perfectly acceptable for what it was. A one-off cameo, 2 or 3 scenes, filling screen time, whatever, And the show has always done this. Bill Burr was in earlier seasons, Like, when you think about an actor who's going to bring, like, gravitas, or, like, who's going to enrich the Star Wars world, Bill Burr is not the guy that comes to mind, is he, Like, he could have fallen flat on his face. People generally, I think, like his character and like him as a person more than maybe they have, like, Megan Thee Stallion is a bit more controversial, perhaps, as a figure. Maybe that influences the whole process. But at the end of the day, it's like, it's normal for a show that has this approach of sometimes being kiddie, sometimes being goofy, and sometimes making questionable celebrity cameo casting choices to fall on its face a little bit while doing these things sometimes. But you're sort of overreacting, guys. It's always been like this. Like, if you're not used to the show being like this by now, like, it is just shocking to me that you would complain as if this is something new. Oh, The Mandalorian is now gone to shit. Well, maybe now you just have your rose-tinted glasses off. Maybe you were so sick of 7, 8, and 9 that you didn't expect anything, and then when it happened, you were so happy, and you were focusing on the good parts, and now once you've gotten used to it, now you're focusing on the bad parts because you're complacent and you're taking things for granted. That's a normal process that we all go through. So keep in mind, Give it a little bit of time to stew and marinate. Go back and watch the season. I think you will not give as much of a damn about these moments as maybe some people did. Definitely not a reason for you to let it spoil your experience, and definitely does not take away from the quality, objective quality that the show puts forward overall. And also, even when the show is goofy and falling flat on its face, even if you don't like that whole episode, I mean, it was a bit of a kooky episode. It was something like Alice in Wonderland, like, okay, I wasn't a huge fan of it either, but you gotta hand it to Filoni and Favreau. Even their goofiness enriches the world, contributes, world building is being done in this episode, man. The guy is a separatist. The battle droids make a comeback. Okay, you're a huge prequel hater. Whatever, man. At the end of the day, for this franchise to continue, it has to make peace with its own self. All of it is Star Wars. The original trilogy is Star Wars. Prequels are Star Wars. This is Star Wars. Unfortunately, 7, 8, and 9, also Star Wars. And the fact that we have these two guys who are trying to galvanize and unite everything, that's a good thing. That's a way forward. Like Bo-Katan uniting the Mandalorian clans. Maybe it's a bit metaphorical on part of John and Dave as well. Maybe they're putting a little bit of their own personal journeys into this character. At the end of the day, the guy, the separatist guy, who talks about the Republic and then the Empire. It's connecting these plot threads and bringing the world together. It's world building. It's adding lore. It's enriching the universe. Yeah, it's goofy, but at least it's doing something objectively that benefits overall storytelling. You cannot say the same for fucking the casino scenes and the running foxes in episode 8, can you? That was just nonsensical for the sake of being nonsensical. That was some producer sitting there thinking, or some director maybe, we need an interesting environment for interesting things to happen in. Make it Star Wars-y. And like Finn and Rose by the end of it were riding around on these horse foxes for some goofy ass reason, and everybody hated it. This everybody hates, or maybe not everybody, but a lot of people hated. Fair enough, but at least it's trying to contribute to the overall story of the universe. There's a goal and there's a purpose to this, man. That's a lot more valuable than any empty corporate pretty looking nonsense. Again, I guess the overall point in addressing the criticisms is that, man, the show still has that same heart, and it's still trying to do the right thing, and it succeeds massively at times. And even when it's doing something stupid, it's still in the spirit of making this whole thing better. It's still in the spirit of developing the story, advancing the narrative, enriching the universe. There's somebody out there who is trying and thinking and putting in work to progress the story forward, who's thinking consciously. How do we put and connect all the dots? How do we bring this universe together? And what direction are we setting for the future in terms of storytelling? As long as there's somebody out there who's doing that, and there's a show or shows that are trying to do that, even if at times they fail on their face, Star Wars is alive, and there is hope for Star Wars. And I will take it any day of the week over any Rian Johnson movie or poor old Solo, for sure. And objectively, when the show is bad, and at times it was, considering all of that, considering this purity of spirit and this purity of heart, considering the fact that the Star Wars universe is alive and somebody has the right approach and the right way to think about it, thinking of story in the future, setting up new things, drawing upon the past and the rich universe, connecting dots, world building, and thinking of how to bring in new characters, doing that to progress the plot forward and to add new things. Man, That's creativity right there. Bringing in the new, reconciling in the old, using the old to bring in the new, connecting the dots, connecting the old with the new. That's literally keeping the Star Wars universe alive and progressing the franchise forward. The only way that you can progress a franchise, a universe, a story, a plot, a world around and alive is if you do that. And these people are dynamically doing exactly that. And I cannot, for myself, look at that and say that I can't get on the disdain train and, dismiss the Mandalorian. Oh, here we go again. It's going down the shitty dark path. Nah, to me, it's overblown. Those are my overall takeaways on why the season is of utmost quality and why the criticisms are a bit overblown and unfounded at the end of the day. Even when the show is objectively goofy and stupid, I guess, I'm not knocking everybody who didn't have a great experience. I guess, there is this personal factor as well where I also am able to close my eyes and accept the goofiness, like, okay, it's Star Wars. At the end of the day, it's for kids. Okay, there are some stupid things that happen. That's been the way with Obi-Wan and all the other shows as well. Whatever. The overall quality and the overall spirit at the heart of the show, and the fact that there's narrative integrity to this whole thing, and genuine creative vision, respect and admirations for the show. Less stupidity in the future, fair enough. If you didn't like it because it was too stupid at times for you, I get it. My proposition is try giving it a second chance. Don't write it off so fast, essentially. That's it. So I guess those are my overall takeaways and overall breakdown and analysis of The Mandalorian Season 3. I hope it was somewhat enjoyable. I hope it wasn't too annoying, too meandering at times. And I hope that this perspective brought you a little bit of food for thought, and was somewhat interesting for you, dear audience member. Now, if you would like to hear me meander up and analyze different shows, books, fandoms, worlds, whatever the hell it is you want to call it, fruits of imagination, I guess. And you want more of the same, and you found whatever the hell I was saying throughout this somewhat interesting, I implore you and I invite you to subscribe. I hope that I would be able to keep producing similar content in the future, and I hope that, it'll retain some sort of entertainment value. But we'll see, I suppose. Yeah. Anyway, thanks for listening, everybody. See you around.